19-year-old Charles McCullough, who was an amateur photographer, asked his friend to take him out to Crater Lake. Charles says to him, kinda jokingly, "Yeah, if you don't hear from me in a couple of days, file a missing person report." Sure enough, a couple days later, when Charles doesn't show up, that friend does file a missing person report, and an extensive search is conducted at Crater Lake to find Charles. There's nothing. His father actually flew out there and stayed for several months, just constantly searching the area. Found nothing. So a year later, a couple of backpackers were hiking the area around Crater Lake and they get lost. They're well off the trailhead and they discover a backpack. And so when they gave it to police, it turned out that it was Charles McCullough's backpack. So investigators went out and started looking in the area that this backpack was found, which was 12 miles off the trailhead. This is well off the trailhead. And near the backpack, they find what remained of Charles McCullough. They found his pants unbuttoned and on a log, as if he was sitting on the log and then just disappeared into the ground. Sticking out of the pants were his socks, no shoes, and in the socks were his feet bones. There was no jacket, there was no upper portion of his skeleton. 12 feet away, they find a portion of his skull. And that is the last thing they find of Charles McCullough. And ultimately, it was determined that he died of natural causes. His family was not prepared to accept that, however, when you look at some of the circumstances. He was also 12 miles off the trailhead, and when he went missing, there had been approximately 5 to 7 feet of snow that had dumped in the area. So how did he move 12 miles off the trailhead in 7 feet of snow, especially when you consider he was not an outdoorsy type, and even when he got dropped off by his friend that drove him out there, he even said later on that he felt like Charles was very ill-equipped for the environment he was going into. But at the end of the day, it was left as, sorry, he went missing and he died of natural causes, and that was that. Bart Schleyer was a famous outdoorsman and hunter. Bart books a float plane to take him 175 miles north into the Yukon Territory for him to go hunt moose on his own for 3 weeks. The plane leaves and comes back 3 weeks later, and there's no Bart. Now the pilot went over to where he had been told his campsite would be, and he found the campsite, and it looked like someone was still living there. It didn't look like it had been destroyed at all. And then near his campsite, he found a dry bag up against a tree, and then next to the tree was his bow and some arrows, and it looked like an area where a hunter might have been sitting to call in moose. Near the dry bag and the bow and arrow, they found Bart's teeth and a couple of shards of bone. Initially, the thought is, well, a large predator must have snuck up on Bart and eaten him. Except there's a couple of huge problems with that theory. He would never get snuck up on by a large predator. He was so accomplished in the wilderness. Also, in the area where his teeth and some of his bones were found, there was no sign of what they call a death struggle, where you're fighting for your life, you're smashing into everything. There's none of that. His camp had food out in the open. And if a large predator had come through like a bear, it would have raided the campsite, and it didn't. And so the way this was left was he was attacked and eaten by a predator. But nobody believes that because that wouldn't happen to Bart, and the circumstances around his campsite didn't really add up. Christopher Tompkins was working as a surveyor, and he was assigned to this 4-man survey crew, and they were walking along this road, and Chris was the last one in line. And the third one in line would later tell investigators and police that as they were walking along the road, he turned around, saw Chris, kept walking. A few minutes later, turned around, and Chris is gone. The third guy hails the other two, and they go, and they're like, where did Chris go? They're looking down the road, like maybe he stopped, but they can't see him. They start walking down the road towards where he would have been, and they find on the ground a pile of loose change and some of his tools that would have been in his pockets. And then they see one of his boots stuck in the barbed wire, because there's a little barbed wire fence that was running the length of this road. They search the area, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign of him, and it didn't make any sense. 9 months later, they found his other boot near a swamp 900 yards away, but it didn't provide any more clarity into what happened to him. However, if you look at the pile of loose change and things that were in his pockets that were on the road, it indicates that at some point he may have been turned upside down. And if you think about the entirety of all of these strange stories where the idea being someone could be hunting humans, just picture in your head Chris Tompkins walking along and something flipping him upside down, dumping the contents out, and then being gone in a matter of a minute. That's going to do it, guys. Until next time, take care.